Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of the Real People Podcast. I'm Dan, the host of the Real People Podcast. I'm very excited to be talking to my friend, family member, Peter. Say hello, Peter.
Hello.
So Peter and I are going to be talking today about JK Rowling, about the Hogwarts Legacy Controversy. I want to understand it a little bit better, and I really trust Peter's opinion. Peter and I have had some great conversations, and I think he's somebody, as to adding value to this podcast, who can help everybody maybe understand it a little better too. More about Peter and Hogwarts Legacy, but let's learn about Peter. Peter, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a fat, cis, white guy who makes a living helping people with disabilities get into the job market. I have been doing that for a while, partially because I have disabilities of my own, and I started out as a client. And it's probably one of the most important things that I've ever done in my life. I probably get more out of this job than any job I've ever done. So,
and that's great. And I imagine that you've probably worked with members of the trans community. Before we jump into that, you mentioned the term cis, and can you just define that really quick for anyone maybe not familiar?
Cis is basically the opposite of trans. Cis is those of us who were born one sex or the other, male or female, and we identify as that sex and gender. So, if you are born a male sex and you live as male gender, then you're cis. And it's not an insult like some people take it. That's who you are.
You just are.
No big deal.
Right. So no, and thank you for defining that. That's really the intent of this podcast. Obviously, we are both two cis males. We don't have the real stakeholders here for this conversation, but I feel like, part of this podcast is to kind of help get some understanding of what's going on with this particular situation with JK Rowling and Hogwarts Legacy. Can you give just a general breakdown, as you understand it, of why the trans community is feeling the way they're feeling, and the background behind it?
Okay. That's a big order, but I will do my best.
I would trust no one else to put this in a coherent timeline.
Yeah. So let's see. Back in 2018, JK Rowling liked to tweet that called transgender women men in dresses, and said it was an accident. And then she favored she said she was holding her phone incorrectly. Then in 2019, Rawlings tweeted her support for a woman named Maya Forstarter, who'd lost her employment due to her gender critical views. And gender critical is the term that they use now instead of TERF, which was trans exclusionary radical feminist, which they liked being called until people started using it to actually identify them.
Okay.
And then they decided they didn't like the term. So now they use gender critical. But Meyer Forstarter got to be kind of a center of quite a bit of firestorm in the whole scene, the anti-trans scene in England.
Right.
And Rowling came out in support of her. And so that was kind of the beginning of how it all fell apart. And then, so Rowling tweeted, if sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. Mm-hmm. Which, okay, that's not particularly supportive of trans people at all. And so it started getting pretty heated, and a lot of the actors and actresses that were in the Harry Potter movies went, no, this isn't going to work. Some supported her, but also backed away from her at the same time.
Sure.
So Rowling's solution to this was to write an essay.
Right.
Which really, your solution is never, ever to dig yourself in deeper. But this was what she did, and proceeded to say that trans people were eroding women as a political and biological class. And she did go into how she was a survivor of domestic abuse and sexual assault, which really has nothing to do with trans people, but somehow wanted to tie that in with bathrooms and changing rooms and men believing and feeling that they're women. And yet the number of times that trans men and women have ever assaulted anybody is almost zero, whereas it's usually cis men that do that kind of awful, pardon my language, shit, is the ones that do that stuff. So
sure,
she got called out on that.
Right, and as I understood the controversy, this was my initial take, and maybe you can clean it up, is that she came out in support of trans, and I believe her quote was, you know, if you're trans, I will march in the streets with you if I genuinely believe you're being oppressed. But she essentially felt very strongly about making the distinction of sex and gender being separate things, and that there is a legitimate threat of having trans women in their spaces where they may not have traditionally been. And you mentioned the trauma that she underwent. Can you, because that was my initial understanding, and you know I've talked offline, and you said there's a lot more to that.
Okay, so one of the easiest ways to avoid being accused of being anti-trans is to say, oh, I support trans people, I just don't want trans people around me. You know, it's like, oh, I support Black people, but I really don't want them living in my neighborhood and dating my children.
Right.
You know, I support trans women and they're fine, but I really don't want them in my bathrooms. Seriously? That's your approach to this? You know, the idea that you're saying what she said, which is that, oh, man in a dress is not a woman. I can pull up hundreds of pictures of trans women that you could not tell are men. Not even for a minute.
Right.
And she is just as easily insulting them as some poor trans woman that maybe doesn't pass. Maybe she hasn't got the money for all the surgeries, but she's still a trans woman. She's still a woman. Trans women are women. Trans men are men. And that's the difference is that sex is one thing. It's largely binary, except for that percentage of people who are born with all of the different things that don't make it binary. And people hate it when you bring that up.
And when you say binary, just to
people, which is about as many as you have redheaded people with blue eyes who have male and female sex, the people that have gametes that are male but they look female, all of that. Those people keep sex from being binary. Granted, there's not a ton of them, but sex is largely binary.
And can you just quickly
Gender, however,
define binary, just in case?
Is a social thing. And gender depends on where you live and what the circumstances are as to, A, how many genders there are, because there are cultures that have more than two, depending on where you are in the world.
Right.
There are places, even here in America, the indigenous Americans
that was my next
have
question.
two-spirits people. And it's been a cultural thing forever. We've had people who were trans going back for generations. And it's not new. It's not something that magically just sprung up. The only reason that we hear more about it now is because it's more accepted and because we have the international news.
I loved when you talked about your work and how people you've worked with, how much they've loved Harry Potter, how much it's meant to them, and
absolutely.
how I thought. I mean, I'm not saying
probably something I should have said right from the very beginning. I want to state that I know a lot of people, not just coworkers, but friends and family who grew up. Some of them who didn't even read until they found Harry Potter. They love Harry Potter. They have tattoos of Harry Potter. They have all the books. They have all the movies. It's very important to them. They make wands. You know, this is something that is vital to their upbringing, and they have a huge spot in their heart for the Harry Potter universe. They don't agree with JK Rowling's. They don't want to buy the games. It's a nostalgia thing, and it's very important to them. And I don't hold that against them. I'm not one of those people that attack them for being into Harry Potter. And I don't for a minute think that they should change their minds at all about that. I mean, people I care about.
Can you talk about how, you know, especially with the community, the game has become this flashpoint of essentially holding J.K. Rowling's words to account. You know, why the game? I mean, there's so many different properties. You know, J.K. receives royalties from Universal Studios, from the movies, from the books still. Why is the game this flashpoint?
Because it's new. Because the people that I know who have Harry Potter as their, who do have the tattoos and all of that, don't go to Universal, don't go to the Potterverse. Anything they get used, or they go to the library, or, you know, that sort of thing. They're making sure that the money isn't going to JK anymore. And this is something that she's getting royalties off of. This is something she stated that when somebody asked her, how do you feel about losing so many people in the LGBTQ community who cared so much about your world, that were such huge fans of yours? How do you feel about losing those people? How do you feel about alienating people that cared deeply about you, who thought you were a supporter? And she said, all I have to do is look at my royalty checks and I don't care. And it's like, okay, fine. Well, then we're not going to buy any of your shit either. So that's the kind of thing that my friends, they don't want to buy any of her stuff. And they'd kind of like other people not to either. We're not going to tell anybody not to.
So buying the game is essentially an endorsement of anti-trans.
Of her beliefs. And she thinks of it that way. It's not that you actually do.
Right.
You may just want to play the game.
Right.
But she looks at those numbers, at those huge numbers of people who are buying the game, and thinks, oh, yeah, they believe in me. They believe what I'm saying.
So, I mean, I you know, you and I have talked offline, and I did purchased the game, I had a very different understanding of the situation, and I'm glad we talked it out. In terms of the not just the game itself as an endorsement, you've mentioned in some of our conversations that there's some particularly troubling circles that essentially, even from the onset of the earliest tweets that JK's run in, and I think the quote you used is, when you start to dabble in one, you start to dabble in something worse. I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly what you said, but essentially, like it becomes like a gateway drug to worse ideologies.
Yeah, she has a circle of friends right now, and I don't have the list right off the top of my head, but they are TERFs. They are people who are genuinely active in doing and saying very bad things against the trans community, and they also believe in some other really awful stuff, including anti-Semitism, Christian nationalism. One of them is, part of the Christian Nationalist Front and some of those other groups, because, as you were saying, if you are willing to believe something, if you are willing to be against one group, then you are willing, and it's amazing how close a lot of these groups are. If they hate one group of people, then for some reason Jews are always real close in the next group that they hate. Yep, it's always Jews next. So yeah, it's something that the people that she surrounded herself with. I think I gave you the link, Sean's video that goes into all the details on that. He explained, he has a picture of the tea party that they are at, and goes into all the people that she's surrounded herself with. Many of them are truly awful. And so, yeah.
So a lot of people I've spoken with, and, I think it's not a surprise that I'm a centrist liberal, and a lot of people that I talk to who very similar views to me essentially had one of the reasons I bought the game is I understood it as JK Rowling was coming from a place of trauma when she said she was fearful of trans women into her space. Did I agree with it? Not necessarily, but I didn't interpret it as this is someone that's meaning to cause harm. Can you talk, and since you and I have talked, can you talk maybe about, like, there's been certain resources from the trans community that have been affected. There's been really, in your estimation, the harm that there is real harm that's been done. I remember watching the Dave Chappelle stand up, and someone said, you've committed violence against the trans community. And to me, I hear that and I'm like, well, that sounds like a bit of a stretch, but you've mentioned that there really is, that's really more of a real comment. That's more real commentary than maybe most people realize. Can you touch on that?
Well, see, when somebody like somebody who is as big as she is comes out with things like that essay, other people use it for bad purposes. And a good example of that, in June 2020, the Equality Act here in the United States was blocked by a Republican senator who used the essay as a reason for opposing the bill. In Scotland, they were trying to pass a similar equality bill. She paid to get it blocked. And the Scottish Parliament, what happened was the Scottish Parliament passed the bill. It went to England. Now, the Scottish Parliament is supposed to be independent. because of
Right.
the rules that were passed back in the early 2000s, and but they still have to be reviewed, which is basically supposed to be rubber stamped. English Parliament, because of pressure from people like JK Rowling, denied it, and the Scots are pissed because
can you talk more about that?
Happen.
Can you talk more about the legislation itself? Like what specifically in the legislation that's harmful?
It was basically just an equality law similar to the one that we were trying to pass here, which just made, trans people equal and able to get medical care. It was basically super, super vanilla. I mean, it was so basic. And that's the other part of it, is that most of those kinds of things, it's kind of like, your most basic kind of bill is nothing radical or out of hand. That's the part that is so absolutely stunning, is that these kinds of things are not ridiculous, they're not crazy, they're nothing else. They're just like giving people the same kinds of rights that you and I take for granted on a day-to-day basis, and yet they're being shot down because of the influence of people on her level. And that's just, what the actual, anyway.
So tying it all together, Peter, for what you've mentioned, is there's a misconception amongst the general populace that most people, myself included, initially believed she was a supporter of the trans community. Your assertion, and you're going to be sharing some links with me that I'll share in the description, that is patently false, and her actions and her words have been different. And I'm happy to share that in the description, because I know that this is, it's important for people to, you could listen to two guys talking on a podcast, but read it for yourself. See it for yourself. And part of this is to get some understanding of why the trans community is upset. I don't expect anyone watching this to become an ally overnight. I think the whole point of this podcast and this episode is just, how can we just get a little more human understanding? I think a lot of times we just get so upset and we refuse to listen to each other. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this whole podcast is let's just talk. Let's talk this out. Let's get it out in the open. And if we can just get even a shred of human understanding, we'll call it a win and call it a day. Peter, what do you see as the best case scenario? I mean, you have this video game that's become this flashpoint that essentially, a book series that seemingly prided itself on inclusivity and welcoming and accepting people that were outcasts. And now it seems that there's a particular community that feels genuinely betrayed. Can you give us the silver lining? Is there a best case scenario here?
There is no best case scenario. It's selling like hotcakes because there are people that want to own the libs. There's a lot of folks whose nostalgia for the books and stuff, they don't, and there's a lot of people who just don't know about this. So ultimately, the only thing that can happen is that in a year or so, nobody's going to remember the game existed, because there'll be another new hot game that'll come along, and that's probably about the only thing we can count on. AAA games come and go, and ultimately there's a good chance that this one will too. What we do have to worry about is that more and more trans kids, trans men, trans women are being murdered and beaten and abused. Just last week, Brianna Gay was murdered in England. This kind of stuff is happening all the time. And this is the kind of thing that we can't keep happening. And it requires all of us to stand up and say, no, we just don't want this to happen anymore. And we need to, as a group, as cis people, protect the the people that can't protect themselves. We just can't let this kind of stuff happen. And I know this is supposed to be about a video game. I know this conversation is supposed to just be about a silly Harry Potter game, but it really isn't just about that. It's about people who are being hurt, badly hurt. So,
and I think even people like, as I mentioned myself, and maybe there wasn't a realization of. I mean, you've mentioned rapidly increasing violence. And the numbers were always high, to my knowledge, of violence against the trans community. And they've and I think from our conversations, you've mentioned that they've spiked even higher recently. So I think it's important to, whether you don't find yourself in alignment with the trans community, the LGBT community, I think I would just want people to hear this, hear that these are humans that are afraid, that are scared, that feel marginalized, and you don't have to, donate to the Trevor Project. You don't have to march in the LGBT Pride Parade, but just hear it, process it, and if you could just offer a little bit of empathy, I think we can call that a win for the day. Peter, you've been great. I've always trusted your opinion. I knew you'd be a great guest, and you never disappoint. Would you like to take us home on a last point about the game, how people can, how people can be more aware, be better allies, or just simply be better informed?
I belong, I'm old. I hang out on Facebook. There are pages for indigenous people, trans people, people of color. Just join one, hang out. Don't post anything. Just read the posts. And you may disagree with 80, 90%, but you'll learn things. You'll know about what's going on in those communities. You'll know about stuff like this. And you'll get out of your particular wind tunnel. And that's what I do. That's how I know about these kinds of things, and that's how I learn. Otherwise I'd just be, in this little wind tunnel. Get out of there. Get out and learn about other people who live in a completely different world than yours. You don't have to comment. You don't have to say anything. Just read it and check it out. And like I said, you may disagree with most of it, but at least you'll know what's going on.
Yep, I love it, Peter. As always, I always appreciate your insight and how knowledgeable you are about these topics and the way you present it and share it. I really appreciate it. Would love to have you back on as a guest for more episodes. I know there's so much to talk about, but this has been a great first episode. I'm Dan. This has been the Real People Podcast. This is Peter. I appreciate Peter doing this interview all the way from Alaska. And we'll have Peter on again soon as a guest. Have a great night, everyone, and take care.
Take care, man. So.